Joining me today from Washington in the Capital TV show, David Mack. He's a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council Middle East Program. Also, he's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and former U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates. Mr. Mack, you're welcome. Long time no talk.
It's very nice to see you again, Maria.
Thank you. I'm going to start about your piece or your article with the Atlantic Council. You said that during a Joe Biden administration, wise leaders of the Middle East and North Africa region would do well to pay more attention to career diplomats and senior military officers that was common in the past 4 years. What do you mean by this remark or this advice?
Well, to a certain extent, the U.S. government during the administration of President Trump had a ruling family. The president, his children and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, these were his primary advisors. And so since so many of the governments of the Middle East either have ruling families or have very inbred autocratic rulers, such as the cases of Turkey and Egypt. They were rather comfortable with this way of dealing and thinking to themselves, well, all you have to do is to talk to somebody in the Trump family, and that's the way you can conduct business. And in fact, President Biden, who has long experience in Washington and is used to a more organized and institutionalized way of dealing with foreign governments, has made it very clear, and this is reflected by his Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, that they want to return to a more structured way of dealing with all foreign countries, including the countries of the Middle East.
This is wonderful. They should also, as you said, stop looking for shortcuts to the White House, as it would be a mistake to try to pull a fast one and experienced elected leaders and their political appointees. So can we talk about some people you are interested to talk about them? Or are they in the government right now, in the administration, or somehow?
Well, you know, there were people who were close business associates of the president and of Mr. Kushner and so on, and had been big contributors to the Trump campaign, who immediately upon his election, even before he was inaugurated, started reaching out to Middle East governments and providing and offering their services as intermediaries in return, of course, for big contracts as consultants and business partners. And this seemed to work to a certain degree in trying to reach relationships and to build relationships between the very top of the two governments. But what it didn't do was build relationships between the institutions and the peoples of the United States and the peoples of the Middle East. You can point to all kinds of examples where these kinds of what we might call transactional deals between the White House and Middle East leaders got a lot of attention, got a lot of headlines, but in the end did not build anything that had a lasting significance in the relationship.
But don't you think that the Trump administration succeeded in dealing with the Middle East for peace, and they had lots of something to talk about? They did a great job in foreign affairs.
Well, I think this had its real limitations. I, of course, supported the idea of a normalization of relations between Israel and Arab countries. But this shouldn't be confused with peacemaking. Peacemaking was the kind of thing that President Carter did between Egypt and Israel, two countries that had fought really serious wars. Peacemaking was what some Norwegian diplomats helped get started, and President Clinton continued between Israel and the Palestinians and between Israel and Jordan. It would be fantastic, in my view, if the Trump administration could have achieved peace between Israel and Syria, or peace between Israel and Lebanon, or peace between Israel and Palestinians. You make peace. You know, former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel famously said, you don't make peace with your friends, you make peace with the people with whom you are fighting wars. Israel never fought a war with the United Arab Emirates or with Morocco or with these other countries that are far away. And in fact, if you really want to look at the history, the improvement of relations between Israel and these countries began very much with the 1993 Madrid conference at the time of the elder Bush and Jim Baker. It was that conference that brought people together. And believe me, Israeli offices and Israeli businessmen started opening up all over the Arab world. There had already been very strong relations between Morocco and Israel. They just didn't call these relations official. But
yeah, it's without announcement. Let me discuss what you said. The Israeli government has a breathing period before Washington will again approach the knotty problem of peace with Palestinians. But normalization with a distant Arab government is not the same as peacemaking and not a substitute for dealing with Israelis' existential dilemma. How you explain more about this comment or this idea?
I think that the Biden administration is going to be very careful. It has many very high priority domestic issues to deal with. It has some very high priority foreign policy issues that are much more important to it than relations with the Middle East, things like climate and China and immigration and so on. So it will focus on many things before it will focus on specific foreign policy issues with the Middle East. But it has chosen one, and I commend it for it. It has offered its services to Lebanon and Israel to help broker a maritime peace between these two countries that would be...
David Hale came out with no results after his last visit, and it will be the end of any discussion coming up.
Well, yeah, it's a tough one. But if it could be achieved, it would be a huge boost for the Lebanese, for the future of the Lebanese economy. And it would be peace between two countries that share a serious border on which wars have taken place.
Do you think that Hezbollah, which is supported by Iran, is blocking any negotiation with USA?
Absolutely. I think the Hezbollah is a very, very big problem. As you know, the U.S. government, some of my former government colleagues have a history with Hezbollah that was not very good. I've had friends who were killed by terrorism of the sort that Hezbollah it shows, or they were taken hostage and so on. So we have some serious problems. But Hezbollah is a very... It is a part of the Lebanese government, and the problem is, how do we have a normal relationship with Lebanon and keep Hezbollah, this is important for both Beirut and Washington, to keep Hezbollah and its representatives in a limited position in the relationships so that we can have fruitful relations without having to deal too closely with Hezbollah. One example, for example, is I look forward to the United States doing much more to help American University of Beirut and the Lebanese American University, two universities that go back for over 100 years and have been very important to the development of people-to-people relations between Lebanon and the United States.
But the problem is much more bigger, Mr. Mark. Don't you think that now, after the news about sending drugs to Saudi Arabia, and of course Hezbollah is responsible, they are always been doing this, especially in the TBA area with Latin America, and this is their job. They get money to fund their terrorism attacks through drugs. I don't know what else.
Yes, and I applaud the decision of the Saudi government to curtail some of its relations with Lebanon as a way of sanctioning the involvement of Hezbollah in things like drug trafficking and trafficking in arms and so on from between Lebanon and other countries in the Middle East, and notably between Lebanon and Iran. And so I think it's very important that we approach.
Do you think that the way they are leading the negotiation is effective somehow for the benefit of USA to be a strong partner that they can impose their rules or their way of doing it, because they want to include not only the nuclear program, also to forbidden the ballistic missiles and whatever, and attacking the sovereignty of Saudi Arabia and the allies of USA in the Middle East?
Well, this is a very high priority issue for the Biden administration, and they have a certain amount of leverage with Iran, which I think they're going to be careful to use, just as the Iranians are going to be very, very tough negotiators. But, I think these new negotiations will probably end up with a somewhat different structure of the agreement between Iran and the international community. Mind you, it was never an agreement between Iran and the US. It was an agreement with Iran on one side, with all 5 members of the Security Council, plus the government of Germany and the European Union, and the International Atomic Energy Agency on the other side. So the US was only one partner. And that, frankly, gives me great comfort to know that on our side of the table, we have the preponderance of the international community, including even Russia and China. And this should make Iran very keen to get some kind of agreement. But in the future, the agreement is also going to have to include at least, maybe not in terms of specific issues, but it has to include some way in which we can deal with things like the Iranian missile capacity, which threatens all the countries of the Arabian Peninsula and threatens Iraq. We have to have a way of dealing with Iranian support for terrorist organizations, whether it is Hezbollah or other organizations,
or Al-Houthis or whatever in Iran.
And in Iraq, where Iran has supported terrorist activity. So we will need to have some kind of avenues for dealing with these problems. It won't be enough just to have a nuclear agreement. And it's extraordinarily important that this time there be a much greater and more robust dialogue between the United States and its allies in the Gulf Cooperation Council than was the case in the first agreement.
You said, sorry for interrupting, but we have a short time to finish our interview.
Okay.
On the other hand, you said the UAE has improved its image in various ways, such as trimming its role in Yemen and normalizing interaction with Israel through the Abraham Accords. A more constructive role in Libya would also help assure a better relationship with Washington on matters more central to the UAE's care strategic interest. Why did you choose only the two topics, Yemen and Libya? What was important about it?
Yes, I think the UAE took this very important initiative in separating itself to a significant degree from Saudi policy with regard to Yemen, because there is an extremely high level of opposition in Washington. And this is bipartisan. This is Democrats as well as Republicans to some of the things that have been done by the Saudi-led coalition in Yemen and this huge humanitarian problem, probably the greatest humanitarian problem in the world right now. So this was a smart move by the UAE, and I think and I think we are already seeing the UAE also separating itself from the policy of Russia with regard to Libya. And this was very important because the UAE had gotten itself in the unfortunate position where, in the view of many people in Washington, particularly in the Congress, it was on the same page with Russia because these Russian mercenaries that have come in and have greatly complicated the situation some people believed, were being financed by the UAE. I have no idea whether there's any truth at all to that. But I think it's one of the things that has been discussed very early in the Biden administration. It's one of the things they've discussed at a high level with the UAE. And we can see the UAE beginning to take a position much more like that of the United States and European countries rather than Russia.
This is a good point. My last question, Wall Street Journal titled, Biden's recognition of Armenian genocide helps heading of a deep wound for Armenians. Biggest prize has long been acknowledgement from U.S. with its million-strong diaspora. From your point of view, how would that recognition reflect on the Armenian-Turkish relationship? American-Turkish relationship?
Yes. Well, Turkey had already pulled away from its very close relationship with the United States. We have serious disagreements with Turkey about the kind of arms that they are purchasing from Russia and how this is going to complicate what had been a very close military cooperation between Turkey and the U.S. We also have some serious problems with Turkey's failure on human rights, the way it has pulled out of the Istanbul Agreement for providing rights for women. I mean, this was an agreement that was, even named after Istanbul, where it was reached. And the Turks and this Turkish government has shown itself to be very much of a one-man show by Erdogan, which does not go down well in Washington. As I say, we don't have a ruling family, and we don't really admire the degree to which a country like Turkey seems to fall under the domination of one man. So there was already a much reduced warmth to U.S.-Turkish relations. And so when, as happens every year, there was a lot of pressure on the U.S. president to mention the Armenian genocide that took place during the last years of the Ottoman Empire. Yes. President Biden did that, I think, because he realized that Turkish-U.S. relations weren't as close as they once were, and he had been very much involved and would like to get back to closer relations, but the changes are going to have to take place in Ankara. And this was purely symbolic. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the important thing is for Turkish historians to recognize the reality of this.
Do you think this will only affect the image of Turkish regime right now, led by Erdogan, or there is any legal action will took place later on?
Well, the image of the Turkish regime in the United States was already not very good. So I don't think it could be harmed very much. I think this only enhances the image of the Biden administration and gives it credibility with the Congress and the American people, and eventually improving our relations with the Turkish government, as we very much hoped will be the case, because Turkey has an extremely important position in both Europe and the United States and the Middle East, and we need to work with them.
Thank you so much, David Mack, for being with us. You are the USA former ambassador to UAE, and we are happy to have you again in our show. Thank you.
It was my pleasure to talk to your audiences.